Fellow students, thanks again for your patience with me. Since I'm not in class today, I appreciate you taking today as a virtual day and watching the lecture online. Today we're looking at the birth of Israel. Earlier this week we talked about the Exodus and really how the story of the Exodus is in one sense a critique of evil and the way evil is embodied in human societies. And Egypt and Pharaoh become this great symbol of what fallen human nature and fallen human society looks like. And the Exodus story is the quintessential picture of salvation or liberation. God is all about delivering people from oppression, delivering people out of slavery, whether that's literal slavery or the slavery of addiction or whatever that form takes. The Exodus story becomes the story of salvation and liberation. Now, on the one hand, there's the deliverance from evil. There's coming out of oppression. Today, I want to look at the other side of that, which is the transformation. What's on the other side of? So when we talk about salvation, there's always 2 points. We're saved from and we're saved for. In this case, Israel is saved from Egypt, from slavery. But what are they saved for? What does their new life look like? Well, they're saved for freedom, and they're saved for flourishing in this new land of Canaan. And today we'll look at how the people are formed to be able to live that life, and then how the law or Torah is given to them as a kind of blueprint or roadmap for human flourishing. So immediately after the Exodus, Israel finds itself in the desert, and you can see on the map the Sinai Peninsula. This is where the story takes place as Israel is wandering around. They've left Egypt. They wander around the Sinai Peninsula. Ultimately, in the story, it's 40 years. The wilderness here is, of course, part of the story, part of the landscape, but it's also a potent symbol. Because a wilderness area is not exactly a desert, although it's certainly arid, but it's an environment without visible evidence of life-sustaining resources. You can't survive on your own in the desert. So this becomes the place where Israel is going to learn to trust God to provide for them. They're going to learn to take the risk of stepping out, not trusting themselves or their empire or their storehouses. This is what Egypt did, of course. And to only rely on God. Also, it is a symbol of a region outside of the city or outside of the empire. And as we've already seen, the empire is a symbol of any institution which is independent of God's creational purposes, a symbol of human overreach and of human arrogance. So our story begins with Israel in the wilderness. And we can think of the wilderness as a kind of school. Israel is learning to be God's people. Now, God has already chosen them. God loves them. God delivered them because he remembered the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But at this point, that's all. They don't know God. In just a minute, we'll see them being introduced to God. They don't know God. They don't know who God is or what God stands for. So all they've known up until this point is life in Egypt and the way of Egypt, which, again, symbolically is the way of sin, the way of human independence and overreach. So much like we saw Abraham being schooled in the wilderness, God tested Abraham, and these tests were meant to form him or to create character in him. We see these same kind of tests repeated now at the level of society. It was an individual with Abraham. Now it's the whole nation of Israel. And the tests are about the basic things that we need to sustain life: water, food, and shelter. I'm not going to go through all of these. I didn't even ask you to read all of these different stories. Of course, you can go through and read them on your own, or maybe you're familiar with them already. The first thing that happens is the springs in Meribah. But one of them I'll pull out, which is the story of manna. Almost as soon as they get into the desert, the Israelites begin to complain or grumble, and they're hungry. They say, you brought us into the desert to die. at least in Egypt we had food, even though we were slaves. We knew our next meal was going to come from. And so God says, I will take care of you, and I'm going to rain bread from heaven. Each day the people should go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them. Now again, this is not a loyalty test or like a midterm exam. God knows if they would pass or not. This is a formational test. This is meant to help them become something, to transform them. So what is it that the manna is transforming them into? Well, remember what Egypt stands for: hoarding, accumulation of wealth. Egypt is famous for its grain silos, where it had years' worth of grain stored away, even while some people starved to death. Well, God says, you're not going to accumulate wealth. You're not going to hoard your grain. I'm going to give you what you need for today. And I'm going to ask you to trust me today. And then I'm going to ask you to wake up and trust me tomorrow. And then I'm going to ask you to wake up and trust me the next day. You see, if they gathered too much of this manna, which is bread from heaven, literally the word manna means, what is it? If they gathered too much, it would rot and stink and get worms in it. They were forced to, day by day, trust God. Much later, Jesus will give his disciples a prayer in which he says, thank you for, or give us this day our daily bread. What's our daily bread? It's manna. Manna is the daily bread. So Jesus is recalling this time in the wilderness, and he is inviting us to have this same kind of spirituality where we trust God day to day, not looking into the distant future, but just working day to day. So the manna is one story of this formation, and we could look at the waters of Meribah. We could look at them entering into the land of Canaan and other things. All of them are meant to form Israel into a certain kind of people, specifically a kind of people who trust in God to give them the gift of life, rather than trusting in themselves to take the gift of life, as they learned in Egypt. In the narrative, after wandering for 3 weeks, they come to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is still there today in the Sinai Peninsula. As you can see, there's not a lot going on Mount Sinai. It's just a mountain out in the desert. And yet, this is probably the most important point in the biblical narrative. I mean, by sheer number of chapters, the day that Israel comes to Sinai is the most important day. 22 chapters of Exodus, 27 chapters of Leviticus, 10 chapters in Numbers. All of them are on this day. Jesus doesn't get near that many chapters in the New Testament. So what happens at Sinai is very important for the formation of the people. So what is special about this mountain? Well, first of all, in the tradition, this is where Moses saw the burning bush, the same mountain, Mount Sinai. So this is a mountain that's already associated with God. According to Exodus 19, the morning they arrived at the mountain, it says Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. So again, it's like meeting the parents. Moses has already met God. Now he's bringing his girlfriend Israel over to introduce them to God. But notice what the mountain itself is like: thunder and lightning, thick clouds, and these noises, the blast of a trumpet, so loud that all the people trembled. So this is their first experience of the God who saved them from Israel. Moses told them this God's name, Yahweh, but they didn't know who Yahweh was. They never met God until they're here at the mountain. And we already saw in our last class that they're introduced to something of the character of God. He's merciful, he's compassionate, he's known for steadfast love, and so on. Now, one of the important themes in the Old Testament is that God chose Israel. But the question sort of remains open as to why God chose Israel. Of all the nations, why has he chosen Israel to be his people, his special people? And the answer is perhaps not very satisfying. In Deuteronomy 7, God says, it wasn't because you were so numerous. It wasn't because you were powerful, Israel. It wasn't because you were beautiful. It wasn't because you were particularly good or moral. It wasn't because you were smarter than other people. In fact, it says you are the fewest, the weakest of all peoples. God said, I chose you because I loved you and because I made a promise to your ancestors. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who maintains steadfast love, chesed, with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and who repays in their own person those who reject him. So God chose Israel because he loved Israel. Sometimes this is called the mystery of election. God just loved Israel. Did God love other people? Well, actually, later in the biblical narrative, we'll see that God actually did love and in some way choose other nations as well, because every nation has its own story. We'll see that in the book of Amos. But for now, Israel is the chosen people. But what did God choose them for? Okay, he chose them to deliver them from slavery, but what are they chosen for? What's their purpose or mission? God has chosen Israel to become the people through whom he redeems the world. He's called out Israel, and he is going to invite Israel to live in his way. His way is the way of creation. It's what he intended for all humans. He's going to give them a covenant, make an agreement with them. He's going to give them instructions, and he's going to say, model what life on earth should look like. Model ideal human relationships. Model a just and peaceable society. So in Exodus 19, when they come to the mountain, God says to them, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. A priest is one who mediates, one who goes between. So for Israel to be a priestly kingdom means they're going to mediate between the one true God and the rest of the world who doesn't know this God. They are going to be the presence of God, the representatives of God on earth. And this is also why they're called a holy nation. Holy means to be set apart for a purpose. What's their purpose? They are going to embody, to even incarnate, the presence of God on earth. Priestly kingdom and a holy nation. They are going to be the people that God created humans to be. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over everything upon the earth. This is what Israel sets out to do. And so they're going to create a new Eden. That's the goal of this, to restore society, not just for themselves, by the way, but for the sake of the world. They're going to be a blessing to all families of the world, as the covenant was to Abraham and Jacob. So, if you observe these commandments, it'll go well with you, so that you may multiply greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. God is calling them to follow his way, the creation way, so that they can flourish, so that the land can flourish and be fruitful and abundant, flowing with milk and honey, so that they can multiply, lots of kids. Again, you see that fulfills the mandate of Genesis 1:28, where God says, be fruitful and multiply. So they encounter God on the mountain, and God hands them Torah, or law. Now, we associate Torah perhaps with the first 5 books of the Bible. Sometimes they're called Torah. Often Torah is translated as law or commandments, but literally Torah means instruction or teaching, which has a different connotation than law or commandment. This is what God instructs or disciples his people in. And again, what's the purpose of this teaching or instruction? So that Israel can have a healthy, sustainable way of life. It is not so that some sort of mighty, sovereign God can simply be pleased or glorified. They're not obeying for God's sake. Torah exists for Israel's sake, so that Israel can be happy and healthy and whole. One way to put it is that these are instructions for living with the grain of the universe. If you've ever run your hand on a rough piece of wood, you know that when you run it with the grain, you don't get splinters, but if you run it against the grain, it's rough and it can damage your hand. To live in sin is to live against the grain of the universe, against God's intentions. To create a human empire, an institution, economic, political, social, any institution which exists independently of God, that's to work against the grain of the universe. So Israel is being invited to roll with the grain. Torah is often summed up in the Decalogue or Ten Commandments, and you can read these there in Exodus 19. I gave that to you for your reading today. You can also read a version in Deuteronomy. The Ten Commandments break down into two tables, and as you can see in this diagram, the first table has commands that concern God, learning to trust God, and the second table is learning to trust the neighbor. We're going to see that all the commandments ultimately are about loving God and loving neighbor. So what's in the first table? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall have no idols. You shall not misuse God's name. By the way, this doesn't have anything to do with cursing or bad language. To misuse God's name is to try to magically use God's name to gain power for oneself. It's a form of idolatry. On the second table, ethical commandments, which you're all very familiar with, no doubt. Honor your parents. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't commit false or bear false witness. Don't covet your neighbors, either the members of their household, like their wives, or their possessions. Now, in between, sometimes what's called the hinge of the two tables is the fourth commandment. Keep the Sabbath. And if you read through Exodus 19, you would have noticed that keep the Sabbath is unusual among the Ten Commandments. It's unusual because it's the longest of the commandments. It gets more room than thou shalt not murder. But it's also the only commandment that has an explanation. Interestingly, the explanation given in Exodus 19 is different from the one given in Deuteronomy. But the explanation here is keep the Sabbath because which is the seventh day of the week, take off on Saturday, don't work, because God also rested on the seventh day of creation. So Sabbath is this hinge between God and neighbor, and Sabbath comes to be a very important part of the life of Israel. Sabbath rest is not just for humans, it's also for the animals. Animals are to rest once a week, every seventh day. The land itself is supposed to rest every 7 years. And then society is given rest in the Jubilee. Every 7 times 7, 49 years, there's a Jubilee year. All debts are canceled. All slaves are freed. Land which has been purchased is returned to its original owners. So the Sabbath commandments are really at the heart of Israel's new identity, because the Sabbath becomes this regular formation, this way that Israel learns to trust God, to delight in God's good earth, and also to trust and care for each other. So the Ten Commandments are seen as kind of a summary of the law, but they're actually 613 discrete commandments. And they cover all sorts of things. As I said before, they are intended as a kind of instruction manual for life, as prescriptions that will help Israel flourish. So, for instance, there's a recognition of God. And we've already talked about this, that all things come from God, that all things are a gift from God. And instead of thinking that we earned them or deserved them or created the world, we recognize God as the provider and protector. There are limits placed on violence. Like don't kill, don't harm, and so on. There are limits on wealth accumulation, like we just saw in the Sabbath commandments. There are many, many instructions about caring for the marginalized, the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the strangers, immigrants. Those are the groups that are mentioned most frequently, although other groups are mentioned as well. And there's concern for the non-human creation, for animals and for the land, as again we saw in those Sabbath commandments. So, important point here, God is concerned about the material world and about our material lives. He's concerned about the way we treat each other and the way we treat our animals and the way we treat our earth. And to live into this vision of society, the restored Eden, means to restore the harmony which was broken at the fall. Remember, Adam and Eve, because of sin, have a distorted view of one another. They have a distorted view of themselves and their own bodies. They have a distorted view of the land. They think, it's all thorns and thistles. And they have a distorted view of God. Torah is meant to correct that distortion. It's kind of like eyeglasses for Adam and Eve. Well, for all people. The Ten Commandments are one summary of the law. But of course, in the New Testament, Jesus gives another summary of the law. Someone came up to him and says, "Teacher, what's the greatest commandment of Torah?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment." And he's quoting Deuteronomy 6:5. And Jesus said, "The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself," quoting Leviticus 19:18. And he said, "All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So if we wanted to further boil down what's the heart of the law, the heart of Torah, Christians would say it's love. And it always has been love. And God intended it to be love in the very beginning. Love has always been God's instruction in a single word, because love is who God is. Now, if you went back and actually read through Torah in Exodus, Leviticus, or Deuteronomy, you could be forgiven for not seeing love everywhere. In fact, a lot of the laws in Torah are pretty questionable. For instance, there are all these dietary restrictions, which designate some animals as clean and others as unclean. You can eat certain things like goats, but you can't eat other things like pigs or shellfish. It's not clear what makes something clean or unclean other than it ends up in this list. So there's dietary restrictions. There are purity laws, which actually talk about people being clean or unclean. So, for instance, a woman who's menstruating is unclean. A man who has had an emission of semen is unclean and can't go into the temple. A lot of the clean, unclean has to do with bodily fluids or sickness, leprosy, skin diseases, and things like that. However, it doesn't align with our views of like sick. So this is not if you have COVID, don't come to worship. It's, if you're on your period, don't come to worship. So there's all these purity laws, which are a little odd from our perspective with modern science. Then there are these laws with these incredibly severe punishments. So, for instance, if a child is talking back to their parents continuously and doesn't stop, the parents actually have the right and maybe even the obligation to kill their child by stoning. That seems pretty severe. There are also just some bizarre laws. For instance, in Deuteronomy 25, there's laws about if you get into a fight and you kick someone in the genitals or damage their genitals or grab them in the... So some odd things like that that don't have any clear modern application. And then perhaps most disturbingly, there are laws which just seem unethical. For instance, one of the most glaring is laws which condone slavery. Christians, pretty late in the game, came around to condemning slavery in the 19th century, very late in the game. But now, universally, Christians and most of the rest of the world would say slavery is wrong. Slavery is wrong. And yet, owning another person is legal under the Torah. Similarly, the treatment of women. Their life is literally valued less than men. When there are penalties for injury, the life of a man costs a different amount of money than the life of a woman. And then there are other laws concerning divorce and sexual immorality and so on, where a double standard is imposed. So, from our perspective, these laws look unethical. And it raises the question of, okay, if God handed Moses these laws from heaven, why are there so many things that are questionable or strange or that just seem wrong? This is a serious question, and we have to grapple with it for just a few minutes. The first point to notice is that if Torah really did just drop down from heaven, if this is just God's law from on high, we would expect it to be absolutely and utterly unique. But it's not unique. It actually looks an awfully lot like other laws in the Near East. It looks like the Code of Hammurabi, which some of you may have heard of before. This is the law of Mesopotamia. It's older than Torah by quite a few centuries. And it survives because it was etched onto this black stele, and archaeologists uncovered it. Similarly, the Code of Ur-Nammu, which is an ancient Sumerian code, even older, and it survives on these tablets in Akkadian. We have some of those laws as well. And scholars have found parallels. Just to give you one parallel from the Code of Hammurabi in Exodus 21, if a noble has destroyed the eye of another noble, they shall destroy his eye. You see in Exodus an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Here it's an eye for an eye and a bone for a bone, but the same principle of reciprocity. And you can see other laws which are almost word for word the same in the Code of Hammurabi and in Exodus. Again, Hammurabi is the older code. Well, what do we make of this? Well, it's like everything else we've seen this semester. Israel doesn't exist in a vacuum. They're drawing on, they're influenced by the cultures around them. We saw when we looked at the Psalms that one way to interpret them is that David, or whoever the psalmist is, has had an experience with God, and he uses the language that he has to describe that experience, to communicate that revelation. But it will be in his language, in Hebrew. It'll be in the poetry of his time, not like modern beat poetry. And it will reflect the concepts and science and so on of his time, the pillars of the earth and the windows of heaven and so on. Well, similarly with the laws, Israel has an experience or an encounter with God at Sinai. And how do they communicate that revelation that they've experienced? Well, they communicate it here in the form of laws. And these laws look and sound a lot like laws of the time and place. Not surprising at all. Are there some differences? Sure. You may notice here that Code of Hammurabi just mentions the nobles. And many of the laws in the Hammurabi Code are for the aristocracy, whereas the laws of Israel are for all people. In fact, there is no social hierarchy in Torah. So there are some differences, and that's a good thing that social hierarchy has been eliminated. Justice is not just for the upper class, but justice is for all people in Torah. And there's a special concern for the poor and the marginalized in Torah, which stands out and sets it apart from other laws. But it's still very similar in many ways. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that Torah reflects contemporary laws, and ancient laws and ancient ways of thinking about people are very different from our modern ways. Men and women weren't necessarily equal. Slavery was okay, and that's just not the case anymore. It's also important to realize that the laws actually changed. So again, if they dropped down from heaven complete, we would think they're perfect and whole and they wouldn't ever change. But actually, if you read them carefully, you will see older sections being updated and corrected. So here you can see that there are actually several groups of laws, and scholars have noted that these different parts of Torah were written at different times. The Ten Commandments are probably the very earliest stratum. And then something called the Book of the Covenant, and then the Priestly Code of Leviticus. The Deuteronomic laws are one of the latest, and then the Holiness Code, which actually dates to the period of the exile, which we've already talked about. So the laws span several hundred years, and the more recent laws update the older laws. Here's just a few examples. In the older laws, people are forbidden from eating animals that are killed by other animals. But in a later law, it's okay sometimes. In the early law, the sacrificial altar has to be made of a special material. But then in a later version, there are some exceptions. You can use uncut stone. And you can see beef and mutton can only be eaten at the tabernacle. Other laws say it can be eaten elsewhere. Leviticus 7 prohibits those who are unclean from eating meat, but Deuteronomy 12 allows the unclean to eat meat. There are different tithing practices in one section than the other section. And there are other things besides this. These are just a few examples. And you may say, oh, well, those are just minor things. Yeah, but it's the law. And all the law, all 613 commandments are like this. The point is that they change. They are updated sometimes. So what do Christians do with these laws? How do we read Torah? How do we read the Old Testament? Well, here's 3 ways that Christians have historically handled this. One is they make a distinction between grace and law. And they say, well, as Christians, we only follow the New Testament, and those laws of the Old Testament are obsolete. They no longer apply. We don't need to bother with them. A second strategy is to parse out the law, to divide it up into categories, and to say some categories still apply and others don't. Perhaps the most famous division is moral, ceremonial, and judicial. So the ceremonial laws about sacrifices and special clothes and all, they don't count. Judicial, which is like some of the dietary restrictions, things that apply just to the nation of Israel, they don't count. But moral commandments, do not kill, do not commit adultery, those still apply. A third strategy, which is actually what's used by Jews today as well as many Christians, is not to jettison the law, not to give up on it, not to divide it up, but to stick with it, to keep trying to make sense of it, to be challenged by it. So as one rabbinic saying puts it, turn it this way, turn it that way, everything is in it, in the Torah. Keep your eyes on it, grow old and aged over it, and from it do not stir, for you have no better portion than the law. Remember, the word Israel literally means one who wrestles with God. Well, when you throw Torah in there, we can kind of add one who wrestles with God's law, one who wrestles with Torah. So we keep reading, we keep trying to make sense of it, we keep trying to see what does it say about God, about us, and about our world. I mentioned a moment ago that the law is the way that Israel expressed its encounter or experience with God at Sinai. And indeed, Torah is meant to be the embodiment of God's character. Israel is going to be God's presence on earth. They're a priestly kingdom. So you can see in passages like Deuteronomy 10, we first see who God is. The Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who's not partial, takes no bribes, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers, who provides them food and clothing. And because God is like this, you shall also love the stranger. God loves strangers, you love strangers. God loves widows, you love widows. God doesn't take bribes, you be just and fair in your dealings as well. So the laws are meant to be a reflection of who God is, because these are people who are trying to grow into the likeness of God. But as we've already seen with this idea of progressive revelation, as their understanding of God increased, Torah also changed, evolved to reflect their new understanding. So in the older times, they may have thought of God, again, more like the Canaanite gods. And then they would have acted more like the Canaanite gods. And as time went on, and they understood God more and more, not only would their theology change, but their ethics, their law, would also change. Just to give you one example, in the law, there are all kinds of instructions about sacrifice. Got to sacrifice to please God. It is a pleasing aroma in his nostrils, Genesis 9 says. But as you read later in the Old Testament, you see things like this. Sacrifice and offering you do not desire. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. But instead, God wants us to do his will. I delight to do your will, O my God. Or Psalm 50, which makes fun of the whole idea of sacrifice. God says, if I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world and all that is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? So sacrifice, which is, again, really prominent early in the text, as you move on, it becomes clear and clear that God's not like other gods. God doesn't need sacrifices. They don't feed God or please God. The acceptable sacrifice is living out God's way. Again, the way of life and health and flourishing. Ultimately, in the New Testament, this will become very clear and very important. God doesn't need sacrifice. In fact, looking back, we realize, God never needed animal sacrifices. We thought God needed that. But it's never pleased God. It's never been what God desired. Otherwise, you have to say God sort of changed his mind and God wanted people to kill like thousands of animals. And it just doesn't make sense. God has always wanted the heart of people. And of course, sacrifice was a way to represent that, giving the animal blood in place of my blood and so on. But God never wanted blood sacrifices. He wanted obedience. He wanted our hearts. So I hope that helps a little bit in seeing, how do we deal with law or Torah that seems problematic? How do we deal with some of these parts of the Old Testament which are problematic? There are other ways, of course. This is just one way. Now, in the story, in the narrative, while Moses is on the mountain, his brother Aaron leads a kind of uprising. Moses is taking too long. The people say, who is this God? We still don't know who he is. We're not really sure. And so they pile up the gold jewelry that they have taken from the Egyptians, and they melt it down, and they create a golden calf. And they point to the golden calf, and they say, behold, the God who delivered us from Egypt. Now, the calf is clearly meant to be a representation of Yahweh. It's not some other god. The cow was a pretty common image for God in Canaan and in Egypt. So the problem is not that they're worshiping some other god. They're worshiping Yahweh. The problem is the way that they're worshiping with this idol, this static image of God. You see, God, it's not that God is not a cow. Everyone knows God's not a cow. They're not stupid. The problem is trying to represent God or capture God in any static thing. And we talked about this last time with our language, the names for God. When any name for God seems to completely sum God up or capture God, it becomes an idol. God is not a noun, and God can't be frozen, either in a word or an image or a statue. In fact, Moses begs God to show him his face, but God refuses to show Moses his face, because no image is sufficient to capture the dynamism of the great I Am. It's interesting to contrast the golden calf with what Israel ultimately did put in their tabernacle, their place of worship. They did create something, but it's not exactly an image. In fact, it's the opposite of an image. If you've seen Indiana Jones, you know about the Ark of the Covenant. This was in the Holy of Holies, the holiest part of the tabernacle, which would later become the temple where God's presence dwells. And this Ark of the Covenant, as you can see from the image here, this is just a reconstruction. There is no ark anymore. It has these two cherubim, which are kind of angelic beings, and they have their wings spread out and touching. And the cherubim are, of course, not God. They're just angels or servants of God. So where's God? Well, God is in the negative space. God is in the emptiness. God is in the absence. This is one of the things that really sets Israel apart from their neighbors, is their refusal to put God in a box. Instead, they insist that God is this radically open thing, this negative space, this absence even. That God is not something we make, but that God is God. I am who I am. Another way to translate it is I will be who I will be. Israel constantly forgets this, and if you read through the whole history, it's a series of idols, one after the other. either idols of wood and stone or idols of concepts. And it goes on today. It's just human nature to try to put God in a box, to make God controllable, to make a God who serves my needs, instead of seeking and searching for that God beyond words and beyond names. Let me conclude by pointing forward to the New Testament. What we've seen today is the story of Israel becoming a people. We've seen some concrete ways that God formed Israel through the trials in the desert, like the manna. We saw how Torah is meant to be an instruction to help Israel become who God wants them to be. And so, for instance, the Sabbath commandments helps Israel to see the world as God's gift, to recognize their own limitations by limiting their work and their accumulation of wealth, to respect the earth and its animals, and so on. So, all this is about making Israel into a kind of people. They're a people on a mission, and that mission is to represent God on earth, to be a priestly kingdom. Now, we're fast forwarding as we close to the New Testament. This is a letter from the New Testament called 1 Peter. And 1 Peter says this, and here he's speaking to Jesus followers, to Christians. He says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that," here's the mission, "in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." You see, the church, the people of Jesus, are simply trying to be what Israel was trying to be. It's Israel 2.0, Israel Redux. Sometimes the church is called the New Israel. And just like the first Israel built their lives on their picture of God, limited as it was, the new Israel is also building their lives, personal and social lives, on their picture of God. But now they've seen God in Jesus, the suffering servant. And so Peter goes on to say, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you should follow in his steps. So the difference between the church and Israel is not in their mission. It's simply in the fact that they have a clear revelation of who God is. They have a clear view of a God who suffers rather than makes other people suffer. A God who washes feet rather than reigns supreme on a throne. They have this picture of God in Jesus, and their life and their communities are organized around that image of God. Well, we'll wrap up here. Don't forget to take the quiz, and don't forget to put in your attendance code so that you get credit for today. Again, thank you for your patience. I look forward to seeing you on Monday.